Our country was founded on people finding ways to solve problems and work together. It was founded on leaders listening to each other. People in this day and time, with all the information we have, more information than ever before, look for ammunition rather than information. They already have their views, and they are looking for validation of those views and reinforcement of those views.
Everybody's holding on to what I got for fear I might lose everything.
It's too much of pitting people against people. It's the opposite of what we tried to do all through the 60s, the 70s, the 80s.
Ivan Allen saw the race problem not as a threat, but as an opportunity. 3 generations had known and respected each other, even when they disagreed.
If we don't talk to each other, and learn from each other, how do we shape our views?
Somehow, some way, we need to bring the people together. We need a new faith in ourselves as a community.
Relationships are really key when you're dealing with a group of people who all have ideas and they're strong-minded. When you're having pushing and pulling, then that makes you reevaluate your stance.
You don't have to give up your values or your principles, but you do have to find ways to solve problems. And that's what Ivan Allen did. And that's what he, I think, inspired many others that followed him in Atlanta, Georgia, to do. And that's what I think people must learn from the lessons of his life and his leadership.
Atlanta really is to take its rightful place as the epicenter for civil and human rights. To teach those lessons, we can learn it from ourselves, from what happened in our generation.
Despite all the good reports, it's the job of people in the news business to also look at the disappointments. For instance, we are faced with the strong possibility that Mayor Ivan Allen Jr. will not seek re-election in 1969. It would be easy to quote many sensible reasons why we need him, but it's probably better to note that in his 2 terms, he has become part of the soul of this town.
I was 13, the election of 61, and my father took me to a rally or a debate of some kind. The 3 candidates were Muggsy Smith, Ivan Allen Jr., and Lester Maddox. And Lester Maddox was very scary. When it came his turn to speak, he whipped the crowd up into a frenzy. I mean, he was saying everything. N-word. There were some men behind me that were especially loud, and I looked, and their faces were all red, the veins were sticking out, they were spitting their invectives, And I remember very clearly sidling up to my father, get closer to him by his leg because I was scared.
They say segregationist Lester Maddox, and I'm proud to be called a segregationist. Now, Mr. Allen says he wants to integrate them. I don't want to integrate the swimming pool. I don't think you want your little children and the colored children swimming in the pools together. I know that you don't. You might not admit it, but I know that you don't.
The mayoral election in Atlanta in 1961 was a tipping point for this community. Frankly, for generations, there was a clear conflict of history, of views, of politics, of race, and the choice was quite evident.
Ivan Allen Jr. was part of the Atlanta power structure, the only son of one of its most prominent business leaders. Ivan Sr. was perhaps the city's most dedicated booster, and he warned his son that Atlanta would never reach its potential without confronting the race issue.
You had the State House, led by Roy Harris and the Talmadges, foursquare against Ivan Allen, and really underneath, it wasn't just against Ivan Allen, it was against the idea that Atlanta was breaking away from Georgia's racist history and going into the future as a white and shining new city.
The black community overwhelmingly voted for Ivan Allen against Maddox, although Maddox still received a majority of the white vote in the 1961 election.
It was tough, and it was loud, but he was elected.
We could have gone down one road,
which we didn't go, and we took the high road as a result of Mayor Allen's victory. Every one of us is living better as a result.
We were in a moment when the world could be different without destroying itself, where someone just had to be courageous enough to just say, okay, let's try it this way.
From childhood, Ivan Allen Jr. had been groomed by his father to play a leadership role in Atlanta. But Ivan knew almost nothing about half the population of his hometown. I was a member of the comfortable white business establishment, he later said, with only the vague feeling that the Negro's lot was not good. But then, that was the system. This was about to change. In 1960, 2 years before becoming mayor of Atlanta, Ivan was named president of the Chamber of Commerce, just as the student sit-in movement reached critical mass. Inspired by sit-ins at lunch counters in Greensboro, North Carolina, students from Atlanta's 4 black colleges formed a group called the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights. Its leader, a Morehouse College student named Lonnie King, organized a boycott of downtown Atlanta businesses focused on Rich's department store. The commitment of the students stirred Atlanta's black leadership into action. They began supporting the student protest movement.
Our slogan was, wear old clothes with new dignity. Close out your account with segregation, open up your account with freedom. Do not shop downtown. They lost $10 million over the Christmas holidays. There were 70,000 African-American students raising holy hell all over the South about segregation and discrimination in parks and lunch counters, restaurants, churches, you name it. And it was not good for business to have all this turmoil going on down here from a racial point of view. So the Chamber of Commerce, under Allen's leadership, reluctantly got involved trying to solve it.
Through that process, I think Ivan Allen became much more sensitized, much more appreciative, much more aware of the legitimate grievances that African Americans had, where they couldn't go into a downtown department store, where they were clearly meant to feel like a second-class citizen.
You could go from Herons, where African American blacks were welcomed, to Leb's a half a block away, where they were met with a baseball bat. You can see that the mayor himself was on a journey. I mean, this was a guy who had run on the segregationist ticket for governor.
Working with a group of white and black leaders, Ivan Allen accomplished something unheard of in the South: voluntary desegregation of most of the downtown stores and restaurants.
This was remarkable in the 60s. Where else in the country was this going on?
Ivan talked to us very plainly that we needed to integrate. We felt he was a little liberal, too liberal. And I gotta be honest, I wanted, felt it was the right thing to do. Anyway, he did it, and it worked out extremely well. He was strong enough politically to do that and still keep the good feeling in the city. I don't know that anybody else could have done that.
From the African-American side, you had this intelligensia that was being developed through Atlanta University. And on the white side, you had this landed gentry type who was interested in more commerce. You had kind of an unofficial alliance.
The quality of leadership in the black community was just extraordinary and was important in forcing a dialogue in this city that didn't happen in other southern cities.
The hallmark of Ivan Allen is that he was always willing to talk. Whether he agreed with you or not, he had a listening ear. He was seen by the blacks as someone who was trying to help Atlanta, And you cannot help Atlanta without helping black folk.
Ivan Allen takes over the city at a very important point. It was a challenging moment for the city of Atlanta, and it was a challenging moment in the history of cities in the United States, the 1960s were.
The City Hall cafeteria was segregated when I came to work with the city. Nobody at the time, no white people for certain, questioned that. I mean, it was an accepted way of life.
Shortly after Mayor Allen took office, Rachel Pruden Herndon, the first black woman lawyer in Georgia, brought a group of Atlanta University students to the cafeteria and was refused service.
I remember the day well. The young people came in and they wanted to go in the cafeteria. And he took them down to the cafeteria and he told the lady, he said, "These are my friends and we want to have a Coke. If you aren't going to serve them, move from the counter and I'll come back there and serve them." And then he sat down with them, and of course she did right then. I also remember his demanding that the restroom signs be changed and the water fountains. And they had been there in City Hall since the beginning of time.
After only a few weeks as mayor of Atlanta, Ivan Allen had made unprecedented progress in desegregation. Soon, the new mayor would commit his biggest blunder and face one of the city's greatest crises.
The African-American community had been kind of increasingly confined in certain areas, was trying to kind of bust out into new places to move, especially on the west side of town, but then also a bit on the east side of town as well. And they were by and large working-class white neighborhoods who resisted black neighbors coming in and began to organize against the desegregation of their neighborhoods.
The real estate market had been set up to almost encourage racism, right? Because as soon as black people move in, housing prices go down, people's most important investment in their lives goes down, and they're in real financial crisis.
The situation was inflamed when a white developer sold his home to an African-American family in Peyton Forest, a white subdivision in southwest Atlanta. Many white residents responded in fear and anger, and Mayor Allen searched for a way to defuse the situation. He discovered that 800 acres of vacant land just north of Peyton Forest had improperly been zoned commercial. So the mayor erected a barrier on Peyton Road, literally barring blacks from moving into Peyton Forest. This would solve two problems, the mayor thought: calming the white people and focusing attention on the unused 800 acres so it could be rezoned and put to use for low or middle income housing. The mayor saw this as a happy compromise. His illusion was soon shattered.
It was compared to the Berlin Wall, which was erected around the same time. It wasn't the kind of favorable publicity sort of undermined this notion of the city too busy to hate.
He was sending a message that Peyton Road is the dividing point. We're going to redline and not let blacks into this area. We had given so much of ourselves and we had put so much faith and trust in him. And for him to do that was very hurtful.
I remember distinctly driving through Peyton Road when we were looking for this house. We were looking for better things for our children. We were looking for neighborhood schools that would be good for them to be educated in. And for someone to tell you, now is not the time, so I'm going to put up a barricade, it didn't settle well. There are lifetime scars left. You use your experiences to move on and do better. It does not mean you forget it.
Today in the flaming crash of a chartered Air France Boeing jetliner taking off at Orly Airport. All the passengers, 122 of them, were Americans, many said to be members of the Association of Arts of Atlanta, Georgia. It's the worst single plane disaster in the history of civil aviation.
June of 1962, my wife and I turned on the radio, and we heard names being read. And we didn't know what the names meant. We just heard this recitation of names. And then that entire Sunday, the immensity of this tragedy sort of took Atlanta.
But what made it even more tragic was that everybody on that plane was from Atlanta and was really the backbone of the civic, cultural, arts community of Atlanta.
The Atlantans that boarded that plane to Europe to experience the grand presentations of art were core members of a very, very dedicated, knowledgeable arts community here in Atlanta. It was their resolve together to bring that experience home to share with their fellow citizens.
Daddy acted by immediately flying to Paris, which was all he knew to do, but it gave a lot of comfort to the survivors that were here in Atlanta who had lost brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, aunts, uncles.
Mayor Allen insisting that he go to Paris to identify his friends and to show respect from being the mayor. Nobody would do that. Nobody would pick up and go to the scene of a tragedy where you had to look at the remains of your friends.
He was never one to run from a problem. He faced it head on, and I admired the way he responded to any crisis.
The Orly disaster marked the start of an arc of learning for this young mayor of Atlanta that would allow him to build the credibility based on his obvious care and affection for not just those that were lost, but for this community, to be able to lead to the direction that it needed to go and to become a voice across the entire Southeast for what the future needed to look like.
About the time he was elected mayor, I was just getting out of law school. I went to Washington, D.C. and worked for a year, and then I came back in June of 1963 and went back to my hometown in Perry, Georgia. So I was a young president of the Perry Chamber of Commerce when Ivan Allen was serving as mayor. One of the things he did, among many that were so courageous, was when he testified on the public accommodation part of the President of the United States Civil Rights Bill. The way I was brought up and my beliefs before I got back to Perry during that troubled time, I probably would not have agreed with his testimony.
Though there were those in the South who had similar sentiments to Ivan Allen, they were very few, and there were certainly few, if any, that were willing to take a public stand.
Some of us thought he was taking a big risk, that he would kill his political career.
Daddy King told Mayor Allen that if he were to testify in Washington in July of 1963, he might as well consider his career over.
He said, there's no way that I could get reelected if I come up and do that. And John Kennedy said, oh, I think you may be wrong on that, but in any case, I need you to do it.
Mayor Allen thought about this and talked to Louise Allen. And Louise Allen told him he needed to do what he thought was the right thing.
Strom Thurmond was on the Commerce Committee, and it was the Commerce Committee that was holding the hearings on the public accommodations portion of the bill. And Thurmond was the chief opponent on the committee. The bill did not go before the Judiciary Committee, even though it involved these fundamental issues of law. The bill didn't go before the Judiciary Committee because the chairman, Jim Eastland, senator from Mississippi, would bottle it up and would never let the bill out of his committee. That's how so many other laws affecting civil rights had been killed. It was said that Jim Eastland had an extra pocket sewn into his coat where civil rights bills would be put, and they would never get out of his committee. Strom Thurmond put together the list of people who would come in to speak against the bill. And they were very careful not to have just Southerners. They didn't want to make this just an issue of the South versus the North. And so they brought in a right-wing newspaper editor from New England who came and spoke against the bill. They brought in the leader of a neighborhood organization in Detroit who came in and talked about how crime had gone through the roof in his neighborhood in Detroit after it had desegregated. The other side was trying to do the same thing, right? It was vital that they have voices from within the South who would testify that this was going to be a good thing for the South. And they had a hard time finding them.
I've testified before Congress once, and it's a very humbling act. You're sitting low, they're up there high. You know it's theater. You know that they're playing to the cameras, playing to the audience. You know that they have all the power. They can say anything they want to you. And for such a dignified patrician like he was, to sit there and listen to that junk must have been miserable.
Strom would have been a tough inquisitor. He was a lawyer formerly. I think Strom had been a prosecutor, may have even been a judge, so he had plenty of legal skills, and he was an ardent segregationist.
The side of the segregationists was rooted in states' rights, rooted in the freedom of property owners, the freedom of business owners to organize their businesses, to not be interfered by the state. And they pursued that very vigorously. The other side was rooted in the 14th Amendment, or the equal protection of the laws, that the laws should apply equally for all citizens regardless of race, orientation, and all the rest. A public official like Ivan Allen was really in a bind because you'd had the Brown decision that was being applied in areas of public accommodation and transportation and other things. But you also had state segregation laws. Critical to the bill is that why the federal government was able to regulate private enterprise, and the key was the power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. And so it was actually, in retrospect, a pretty controversial way, legally, to extend Congress's power. And it was not without many critics. It was the calling card for segregationists that all of these issues were issues that should be left to the state. One of the things that gave it power is the fact that it was so deeply rooted in American legal and political tradition, that there had been this constant debate within American politics over the rights of states and localities versus the rights of the federal government. And that was being played out in this dramatic scale, in this dramatic way, in every community across the region. The chairman of the committee, John Pastore, a Democrat of Rhode Island, stepped in and accused Thurman of asking these leading, loaded questions. When did you stop beating your wife kinds of questions, implying that this bill would close down all the small independent restaurateurs in the state of Georgia. The folks there in the gallery who were listening, they were on the side of Pastore and of Ivan Allen, and they started applauding. And then Thurman got upset that Pastore didn't silence them for applauding. This made the papers the next day.
Ivan Allen lived in one of the finest sections of Atlanta, Georgia. This was the blue blood section. This was the finger bowl section. They thought Ivan had lost his mind. And some of those closest to him stopped speaking to him. The Allens had to have police protection at their home to keep them safe at night.
I'm sure he said to himself, this is part of the price that I will pay to help save not just the city of Atlanta, not just the state of Georgia, but my country.
Sure enough, the president was right. His standing, especially among white moderates and large numbers of black voters went higher, and he won his second election handily.
It turned out, because he took that position, what we were worried about, that would be the other way around. It was sure that that was the right thing for him to do, and he ended up being one of my heroes.
Ivan Allen throughout the country was hailed as a hero. Back home, not so much. Ivan was accused of being a sellout, and a sellout to the Northern liberals, and a sellout to the local newspapers, which were identified as the main communist house organ in the Southeast.
It's not like the segregationists were making things out of whole cloth just to support their views. I mean, they were segregationists and they didn't believe the races should be together, but they also had a legal argument that had long standing in American legal tradition. What the country was coming to realize is that it was not morally acceptable that the rights of African Americans would be trampled by the radical freedom of the property owner. It was no longer acceptable to have two different sets of conditions and laws, one for white people and one for black people. And that was the moral reckoning of the 1960s.
Between 1960 and 1970, Atlanta grew as much as in all the years since its founding. By the end of the decade, the city ranked 8th nationally in downtown construction and 3rd in non-agricultural job growth. 22,000 new jobs were created every year.
Would that have happened without Ivan Allen's testifying? Maybe, maybe not, but certainly that helped smooth the way for that to happen. Fortune 500 companies coming here to the degree that they did, almost certainly not.
His friendship with Washington was the seed money that got that going. When that federal money started to flow to Atlanta and not to other southern cities, that was the infrastructure on which a lot of these accomplishments could be built.
He saw a future of a city that was going to be a city of not just 500,000 people, but maybe 2 or 3 million people. It was probably competition with New Orleans and Birmingham and Houston, Jacksonville and Charlotte. And we just sort of got out in front of everybody.
Atlanta becomes sort of the fair-haired child of both the Kennedy and then the Johnson administrations. And the landscape of the city really does change.
Ivan Allen's a part of that whole crowd of people that said, what can we do to make Atlanta ready to join the national economy in a big way? Airport, office buildings, racial harmony. Just kind of a page out of Henry Grady's playbook about the New South. Racial moderation, industrialization, reconciliation with the North.
It was really, the whole city, everything was changing. And, but change is not bad. Change brings about opportunity. And that's the way you look at change.
Ivan Allen became more of a pragmatist as he got older. We had to deal with the race issue before the rest of this stuff could happen. I'm just not there with my friends to say that he somehow or another became a liberal, because I don't think so. I think he became a pragmatist because he was a businessman, and I think he understood the power of the dollar. The population is further along than the politicians, but that's not unusual though, because politicians tend to take a blade of grass and throw it up, see which way the wind's blowing, and then they take a stand.
He understood the importance of creating jobs and the importance of art and culture and sports and religion and all of those that go into making a community. And he really wanted Atlanta to be what it has become, which is the leading city in the Southeast United States and one of the leading in the nation.
On the morning of October 14th, 1964, Atlanta native and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was awakened by a phone call. He had just been awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace.
After Martin Luther King Jr. won the Nobel Peace Prize, The overwhelming sense in Georgia and even in Atlanta was we are not going to honor this black man, although he won this superb prize on an international basis for admiration.
It was around this time that King joined a labor picket line for the first time. There were workers at the Scripto plant in Northeast Atlanta who went on strike, overwhelmingly African American, and there was opposition among some of the white business community about that.
Martin Luther King came out prominently, right as he was heading to Oslo to accept the award, came out and spoke about the possibility of a boycott of Scripto. The head of Scripto at the time was a very influential figure in Atlanta, James V. Carmichael, former gubernatorial candidate and an important business leader in Atlanta. It was a group of African American leaders who went to the mayor and wanted to have an event honoring King. And Ivan Allen supported the idea, and so did Ralph McGill, importantly. Robert Woodruff at Coca-Cola understood the importance of Atlanta's reputation for the reputation of the Coca-Cola Corporation. And so they began to put together a coalition. The four men who sent out the invitation for the event was one, Ralph McGill, but the other three were all people of faith. Rabbi Jacob Rothschild, Catholic Archbishop Paul Hallinan, and then the president of Morehouse, Benjamin Mays, who was a Baptist minister. They were the faces of this event, honoring one of their fellow religious leaders, Martin Luther King.
Mayor Allen, meeting colleagues at the Piedmont Driving Club, said, "We're going to have a dinner honoring Martin Luther King, and I would like to see all of you there. I bet you won't be there. You'll find some reason to be absent, but I want you to know that I will be there."
The word went out from Robert Woodruff through Paul Austin to get tickets, and tickets amazingly sold like hotcakes. They had a big gala event at the Dinkler Hotel in downtown Atlanta, and Time Magazine, I think, called it an event that was remarkable even for Atlanta. And they all kind of patted themselves on the back afterwards.
In the end, it was a remarkably successful event and one that benefited Atlanta's image nationally and internationally enormously.
That was one of the finest moments of Atlanta's history, helping people to see the importance of this moment and what it would mean to Atlanta if they did not honor a Nobel Peace Prize winner just because of the color of his skin.
That the authorized representative of a major league franchise has assured us of the willingness and the desire in the form of a verbal contract to move their franchise to Atlanta when a stadium is properly assured. I can almost hear the crack of the bat in the Washington urban renewal area at this time.
Charlie Finley was in Kansas City, and he hated Kansas City, wanted to get out of Kansas City, and he'd been everywhere, Dallas, Los Angeles, everywhere he'd go, he'd say he was going to bring Major League Baseball there. Well, it didn't happen. So I said, Charlie, why don't you think about coming to Atlanta sometime? So I called Ivan Allen, and man, it was a boon to him because he built the Civic Center, and now he had promised him a stadium and all that stuff, and he was getting nowhere. Charlie flew in, and the next morning, Ivan and his driver picked us up. Nobody knew he was in town. Then the mayor took us over to where the old stadium was before they destroyed it. And we were standing out there. The interstate was just getting started. The parts of it were open. And where we were standing is where the old Piedmont Hospital used to be. A lot of old residences there, and they'd all been torn down. The mayor was standing there giving him his spiel about what we could do. And old Charlie, he hadn't worn his wig yet. His wispy hair was blowing in the wind. He said, "Mr. Mayor, you build a stadium here, and I guarantee you'll have a major league franchise." Whew. Ivan was ready to, he could be shot to the moon. At the Commerce Club, something came up about somebody have to pay for the feasible study and so on. And Mills Lane said, "How much will that be?" And he said, "Oh, about $600,000 or something." I said, "I'm good for that." He hadn't even cleared it with the bank yet.
They were building the stadium on money that the CNS Bank had loaned it in such a way that if they had done that today, they'd be inmates of the Atlanta Penitentiary. I mean, it took a lot of gouging and doing and after midnight meetings and who knows what else to get it here. But the city fathers at that time were determined they were going to get it.
Atlanta Stadium was completed in less than a year and came in $1 million under budget.
Mayor said, "Now, Mr. Finley, what kind of measurements would you like for your ballpark?" And I said, "Just a minute, Mr. Mayor. He has to first get this cleared by the American League before he can move." So I said, "Oh, yeah, okay." So the All-Star game was coming up, and we were in Cleveland, and Charlie was having his meeting with the American League owners and so on. And when I saw him come out of the room, I knew they'd turned him down again because they weren't playing ball with him. And he said, "Those bastards," he said, "they turned me down again."
They had this big ball field here and nobody to play in it.
At the same time, the guys from Milwaukee were looking for a way out of town, and they had been in touch with Arthur Montgomery, who was chairman of the Sports Council. One thing led to another, and the Braves decided they would move to Atlanta. Been a better deal if we could have gotten Charlie. He went out to Oakland, and he won 3 pennants in a row and 2 World Series. We would have had all that here in Atlanta.
Atlanta had been striving to become this national city, but Major League Sports kind of makes it happen in a sense. We've arrived.
When trying to justify having Major League Sports here, his reason was, "I want the word Atlanta to show up in the paper every day." Now that's just sort of whimsical, it seems now. But we remember growing up that if we heard it on a television show, we'd sit up with pride, If the word Atlanta came out, if the word Atlanta was on the front page of the New York Times, we were happy.
There wasn't Major League Sports for hundreds of miles away. And to have Major League Sports come here was a huge, huge kind of development. I would say, however, there's complexities with that because Ivan Allen certainly was a proponent of urban renewal. You saw what would become the Civic Center. There's, cleared a whole area of the city, Buttermilk Bottoms it was called, became the Civic Center. The area near the stadium was cleared out, urban renewal projects.
We had this tremendous influx of people. I don't think Atlanta has approached yet the population that it had in 1960, something over 500,000 people, most of whom were newly arrivals, most of whom were poor. They were living in atrocious conditions. The worst slum I ever saw was Buttermilk Bottoms. Mayor Allen saw that. The urban renewal property that had been cleared would add to the economic vitality of the city. He wanted to do the right thing.
Getting rid of slums, right? Building new housing. How can that be a bad thing? And yet it has unintended consequences of breaking up historic old Black neighborhoods and having these highways, dissecting them in institutions of churches and schools that are being disrupted and broken up. That story is related to white flight because as Blacks are being dislocated, they're moving into white neighborhoods and whites are moving out of the city.
African-American opposition to urban renewal took a while to get off the ground, in part because their white allies were the ones supporting urban renewal. I would say a legacy of the Allen administration, in addition to bringing Major League Sports, there's also the reconfiguration of the urban landscape and as exemplified through urban renewal.
I saw him at Rotary one day practically weep when the speaker made his case for how dreadfully wrong we were for urban renewal and to tear down places like Buttermilk Bottom and turn them into public housing conglomerates.
As with other American cities, Atlanta's push for urban renewal amounted to warehousing the poor, while disrupting the urban communities that preceded the new housing projects. These projects became the locus of a new kind of urban poverty.
Tear down shanties and replace them with, many times, out-of-the-way poor transportation, like Perry Homes or something like that. And he said afterward, with a very heavy heart, I thought we were doing the right thing.
I think there are shortcomings to his vision. And in some ways, it's unfair to criticize him, but yet we can look back in the 1960s in Atlanta and see that there are things that happened that we can regret now, too. The lack of emphasis or vision on one might call community, right, of neighborhoods. How are people going to live in relation to one another? How are people of different races and different socioeconomic backgrounds going to intermingle? Instead, what we see today is a metropolitan landscape that is still remarkably divided in many ways along issues of race and class. Atlanta is not unusual when you compare it to other cities around the country. But it is true that Atlanta is one of the more stark examples of racial and class divisions that exist in metropolitan America.
Back in my days, coming up in Summerhill, it was hardcore segregation. It was a mean period. It was hard for Afro-American to dream American dream because it wasn't there for them.
It was a very explosive situation that we had during that period of time. Through Mayor Allen's term in office, we had sit-ins with the Klan marching on one side of the street and the Stewards marching on the others. We had a lot of demonstrations about poor housing and landlords not keeping the houses up. You got to realize that if you've been out working 10 hours a day laying bricks and you go home to an apartment that has no air conditioning, then that's a hardship. This would make anybody irritable.
On an oppressively hot day in late summer 1966, a young black man wanted for car theft was arrested in the Summerhill neighborhood. Suddenly, he broke away from the police officer and was shot in the leg as he fled. Within minutes, civil rights activist Stokely Carmichael, then chairman of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, appeared in the neighborhood with a sound truck in view of the new Atlanta Stadium, calling upon residents to protest, having said earlier that day to a radio journalist, "I think the black people of this country are afraid to protest, and that they must be urged and coerced to come out of that fear, to wake up, to tear up that fear."
No, I'm not placing the blame directly on SNCC. I'm saying that they were there in full force and they agitated the situation that existed there. The blame goes back maybe a couple of 100 years.
It was a large crowd. We didn't think it was going to get out of control. but undoubtedly it got rough. And the crowd got larger and larger. Well, someone notified the mayor, and the mayor came down. And he was trying to calm them down and tell them, you know, what all he was doing to try to improve the housing in Atlanta. He climbed on top of the police car. And I didn't want the mayor to get hurt, to fall off, so I climbed up on the car to hold him.
When I saw it on the news, he was on top of a car in the middle of a mob, talking with them with a bullhorn in a very fearless, if not foolish way.
I remember exactly where I was. I was with my mother. She was gardening, and we had a transistor radio. It was like all news all the time for probably an hour and a half. And I had a perspective on it that my dad had put himself in physical danger, but my mother probably thought that he was about to die. She didn't know how this was going to turn out. She just went right on along, pruning those rhododendron and pulling those flowers and kept going, which is, I guess, just what you have to do.
Atlanta in the 1950s and 60s has been mythologized under this banner of the city too busy to hate. The phrase that was coined, of course, by Mayor Hartsfield. Hartsfield and Ivan Allen both were truly remarkable mayors, and we think of them as a piece oftentimes, right? As these men who were very pragmatic, relatively progressive for their eras. I also think there were important differences between Hartsfield and Ivan Allen that we forget about. I think what you see in Ivan Allen over the course of his mayoralship is that he embraces the kind of issues of the day in a very authentic and genuine way. He felt like he was responsible for that discord, and he wanted to be personally responsible in helping resolve it and to bring peace to a city. It's hard to imagine William Hartsfield doing something like that.
Courage is something a person got to believe in it in your heart. Courage is something that you would die for. I feel like once Ivan Allen reached that point, I believe was in his heart, and he was willing to give his life for what he believed in. Because what happened in Summerhill, he put his life on the line. So if you believe in something, you are willing to pay the price.
On April 4th, 1968, the city of Atlanta experienced its greatest tragedy since the plane crash on the runway in Orly, France. Native Atlantan and civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee.
The night that Dr. King was assassinated was a difficult night in this country. Very few people now remember all of the circumstances. You have to realize that in 19 of the 25 major cities in America, riots broke out in 19 cities that night. And we were in deep trouble. We didn't know what was going to happen in Atlanta. Atlanta was King's home. This was his college, Morehouse. This was his family's home. This was where he grew up. This was a place where more hell could break loose than anywhere else in America had it been treated in improper fashion.
I saw two mayors come on television. Mayor Henry Loeb in Memphis, face contorted with rage, and he talked about the agitators from outside, and that sort of thing, and no empathy or concern about the nation or race or about King. And then to see Mayor Ivan Allen not saying a word, but escorting Coretta Scott King to the plane. It was raining, and he was holding the umbrella for her. And I said, that says it all right there. Many people very affronted by that.
This man who escorted her to the Atlanta airport from her home, it brought tears to my eyes. That's an iconic scene.
There was a feeling among the people in the Capitol, that included Governor Lester Maddox, that Atlanta would suffer extraordinary riots. A lot of celebrities came into Atlanta to join the funeral. There were no riots, but Governor Maddox, to protect himself and the state capitol, lined up armed state patrol all the way around the state capitol to keep the funeral procession back from attempting to do something to him. They marched right into the Capitol, and it was no problem.
It was such a blow. It was just such a heartbreaking experience. It was like one of your brothers had been killed. A pall fell over the whole community, black and white.
Being mayor of a city is a grave responsibility. It's a matter that a person, if he puts himself into it fully, can only carry so long. It's an exceedingly difficult job. There have been 15 or 20 major crises during the last 7 or 8 years. And I have an obligation to family and friends and myself to stretch myself out too far. And I feel that 8 years is a long time to have this privilege.
Historians look at what happened in the past, and journalists look at what's happening in the present, but often overlooked is what would have happened if we traveled a different road.
The rest of the South agreed to polarize. And Atlanta said, no, we're going to work this out together. We had a collection of courageous, visionary global leaders, of which Ivan Allen was the spokesperson and the organizer.
Ivan Allen Jr. was the best mayor I've ever known in my life. Perhaps as much as anyone in the Deep South, he was a beacon of enlightenment. In all ways, Ivan Allen was a hero for me.
He taught us to live our lives in a way to earn the respect of people you once feared.
This was a child of the gentried South, but he was a person who was able to see, to listen, to learn, to act. He was willing to see something more than he was set up to see.
He had a vision of Atlanta transcending its southern roots, not foregoing them, but transcending them.
Ivan Allen was at home with himself. I think he felt in his heart, in his soul, in his gut, that he was doing the right thing.
The history is one of compromise, one of listening to other points of view, one of diversity, one of different geographic and economic interests, one of different backgrounds and races and creeds and colors and religions. And all of that comes together to make a country that we call America.
It's so important that we take this legacy seriously, is that there's so many more lessons to be learned. There's so many young people to be inspired. And as time goes on, we kind of lose track of our heroes. And it's important that we keep telling these stories and that others tell the stories that we told, and they become part of legend, because we need people like that now.
I don't even want to go to heaven right now. I want to stay in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm serious about that.